In the scorching heat of Afghanistan's mountains, a Taliban commander raised his binoculars to scan the valley below. For weeks, his fighters had been disappearing one by one, each taken down by a single, perfect shot from an impossible distance. The locals whispered of a ghost sniper who could kill from over a mile away, someone so skilled that even hardened warriors crossed themselves when speaking the name. What they didn't know was that their phantom hunter was a woman whose official military records had been erased, whose identity was classified beyond top secret, and whose very existence was denied by every government agency. Yet every Navy SEAL who had served in the region knew her call sign, respected her deadly precision, and trusted her to watch their backs in the most dangerous missions imaginable. This is the true story of the woman who officially didn't exist, but whose legend grew with every impossible shot she made in the shadows of America's longest war. Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall, she was at the shooting range with her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran who taught her that precision was more valuable than power. By age 12, she could put 5 rounds through the same hole at 200 yards. By 16, she was out shooting grown men at local competitions, her calm breathing and steady hands making impossible shots look effortless. Her grandfather, Roberto, had noticed something special about Sarah from the beginning. It wasn't just her natural ability with a rifle, though that was remarkable enough. It was her mind. She could read wind patterns like a book, calculate bullet drop in her head faster than most people could use a calculator, and most importantly, she could remain completely still for hours when needed. These weren't skills that could be taught easily. They came from somewhere deeper, some combination of genetics, discipline, and an almost supernatural focus that Roberto had only seen in a handful of soldiers during his 2 tours in Southeast Asia. The first hint that Sarah's life would take an unusual path came during her senior year of high school. A military recruiter had come to speak at the school, showing videos of Army Rangers and Special Forces operations. While other students asked about college benefits and job training, Sarah raised her hand with a different question. She wanted to know about sniper training, about the longest confirmed kills in military history, about what it took to be the best. The recruiter, Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, was initially dismissive. He had dealt with plenty of teenage boys who thought being a sniper was like playing video games, all glory and no understanding of the psychological toll. But something about Sarah's questions was different. She wasn't asking about glory or recognition. She wanted technical details about wind reading, about different ammunition types, about the mathematics of long-range shooting. After the presentation, Torres approached her privately. He had been a sniper himself for 8 years before becoming a recruiter, and he recognized something in Sarah that reminded him of the best shooters he had known. They weren't the loudest or most aggressive soldiers. They were the quiet ones, the thinkers, the ones who could disappear into their environment and emerge only when the perfect shot presented itself. Torres arranged for Sarah to visit a nearby military base where she could observe a sniper training exercise. What happened that day would change everything. The instructors, skeptical about a teenage girl watching their elite training, decided to let her try a few shots at their standard 300-yard range. They set up targets and handed her a standard M24 sniper rifle, expecting her to struggle with the weight and recoil. Instead, Sarah examined the rifle carefully, asked about the scope settings and wind conditions, then took her position. Her first shot hit dead center. The instructors exchanged glances, assuming it was beginner's luck. Her second shot went through the same hole. By the 5th shot, a crowd had gathered. Word spread quickly through the base about the high school girl who was shooting like a seasoned professional. Colonel James Harrison, the base commander and former Special Forces sniper instructor, came out to see for himself. He had Sarah move back to 500 yards, then 700, then finally to 1,000 yards, the maximum distance their range allowed. At each distance, Sarah's shots remained grouped within inches of each other. But it wasn't just her accuracy that impressed Harrison, it was her process. She would lie motionless for several minutes before each shot, studying wind flags, watching for the smallest environmental changes. When she finally squeezed the trigger, it was with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had been doing this for years, not minutes. Harrison had trained hundreds of military snipers in his career, and he had never seen natural ability like this. That evening, Harrison made several phone calls to contacts he had developed over 20 years in special operations. Sarah Martinez, he explained, was something special, something that came along maybe once in a generation. Within a week, Sarah received a visit from 2 men in civilian clothes who claimed to be from a Department of Defense talent scouting program. They asked her detailed questions about her shooting background, her family, her grades, and her future plans. They were polite but thorough, and Sarah got the impression that they already knew the answers to most of their questions before they asked them. 3 months before graduation, Sarah received a letter offering her a full scholarship to study at a small, prestigious military academy that she had never heard of. The Carlisle Institute for Advanced Studies was described as a specialized school for students with exceptional aptitude in technical fields. The letter mentioned that her shooting skills had been noted and that there would be opportunities to develop those abilities further as part of her education. What the letter didn't mention was that the Carlisle Institute was a cover for one of the military's most classified training programs. Sarah's parents were initially resistant to the idea of their daughter attending a military-connected school. Her mother, especially, had dreams of Sarah attending a traditional college and pursuing a normal career. But Sarah had made up her mind. She had found her calling and she wasn't going to let anyone or anything stand in her way. Her grandfather understood better than anyone else. He had seen the same look in the eyes of young soldiers in Vietnam, the ones who knew they had found their purpose. The Carlisle Institute turned out to be unlike any school Sarah had imagined. Located on a remote campus in Virginia, it housed fewer than 50 students, all of whom had been recruited for specialized military programs. Sarah quickly learned that her classmates included future drone operators, intelligence analysts, psychological warfare specialists, and other roles that required abilities far beyond normal military training. The academic curriculum was rigorous, covering everything from advanced mathematics and physics to foreign languages and cultural studies. But it was the practical training that set Carlisle apart from any normal military academy. Sarah's days began at 4 a.m. with physical conditioning that would challenge experienced soldiers. She learned hand-to-hand combat, survival skills, escape and evasion techniques, and advanced camouflage methods. She studied the psychology of warfare, the history of sniping, and the technical aspects of dozens of different weapon systems. Every lesson was designed to push students beyond their perceived limitations. The shooting training at Carlisle was unlike anything Sarah had experienced, even with her extensive background. Her instructor was Master Sergeant Elena Petrov, a former Russian military sniper who had defected to the United States and now trained America's most elite shooters. Petrov had over 200 confirmed kills from her time in Chechnya and Afghanistan, and she brought a level of expertise and ruthlessness to the training that shocked even Sarah. Under Petrov's guidance, Sarah learned to shoot in conditions she had never imagined. She practiced in driving rain, in snow, in desert heat that made the air shimmer and dance. She learned to account for altitude, humidity, and even the rotation of the earth on very long-range shots. Petrov taught her to shoot from helicopters, from moving vehicles, and from positions so cramped and uncomfortable that lesser students would quit within hours. Most importantly, Petrov taught her how to think like a sniper, to see the battlefield not as chaos but as a complex puzzle with solutions that only the most skilled and patient could find. By the end of her first year at Carlisle, Sarah had achieved shooting scores that surpassed most active military snipers. Her instructors began discussing her future placement, and several special operations units had already expressed interest in recruiting her upon graduation. But Sarah's file was marked with a special classification that even her instructors weren't fully aware of. Someone very high in the military hierarchy had designated her for a program so classified that its existence was known to only a handful of people. The first indication that Sarah's path would be different came during her second year, when she was selected for advanced training that even her Carlisle classmates weren't offered. She began working with instructors whose names she never learned, who taught her skills that went far beyond normal military sniper training. She learned to blend into civilian populations, to speak multiple languages with perfect regional accents, and to disappear from even the most sophisticated surveillance systems. These mystery instructors taught Sarah how to modify her appearance, how to adopt different personas, and how to live for months in foreign countries without any official support. She learned about different cultures, religions, and political systems, knowledge that seemed unrelated to shooting, but that her instructors insisted would be crucial for her future missions. When she asked where this training was leading, she was told only that she was being prepared for operations that required the highest levels of skill and discretion. During her third year, Sarah's training took on an even more specialized focus. She worked almost exclusively with a single instructor, a woman known only as Director Walsh, who had apparently held senior positions in both military intelligence and special operations. Walsh explained that Sarah was being considered for a program that officially didn't exist, one that required absolute secrecy and complete dedication to the mission, above all other considerations. The program, Walsh explained, involved operating in the deepest cover imaginable. Sarah would have no official military rank, no government recognition, and no legal protection if she were captured or killed. Her existence would be known only to a small circle of handlers and the special operations team she would support. In exchange, she would have access to the best equipment, unlimited training resources, and the opportunity to serve her country in ways that few people ever could. Sarah's final test at Carlisle came on a cold December morning in her 4th year. She was awakened before dawn and taken to a remote location in the Virginia mountains. There, she found a shooting position that overlooked a valley filled with realistic targets representing enemy combatants mixed with civilians. Her task was to engage multiple targets at ranges from 800 to 1,500 yards while avoiding any civilian casualties. She had 1 hour to complete the exercise, and she would have no second chances. Using a rifle she had never fired before, with ammunition she had never tested, Sarah systematically engaged 27 targets in 53 minutes. Every shot was a direct hit, and she successfully avoided 14 civilian decoys placed randomly throughout the target area. When the exercise was complete, Director Walsh approached her position with a single statement that would define the rest of Sarah's life. She was ready to become a ghost. Sarah's graduation from Carlisle was unlike any other military ceremony. There were no families present, no photographs taken, and no official records of her achievements. Instead, she found herself in a nondescript office building in Washington, D.C., sitting across from 3 people whose names she would never learn. They explained that from this moment forward, Sarah Martinez would cease to exist in any official capacity. Her birth certificate, school records, and social security number would be buried so deeply that even the most sophisticated intelligence agencies would never find them. In place of her real identity, Sarah would assume a series of carefully crafted cover identities, each backed by years of fabricated history and documentation. She would become whoever the mission required her to be, but she would always remain fundamentally alone. The handlers explained that this isolation wasn't cruelty, it was survival. The fewer people who knew her real identity, the safer she would be and the more effectively she could operate. Her first assignment came within weeks of leaving Carlisle. Sarah was told to report to a small airfield outside Baltimore, where she would meet the team she would be supporting. The briefing was minimal. A group of Navy SEALs was conducting operations in Afghanistan, targeting high-value Taliban and al-Qaeda leaders. They needed sniper support that could operate independently, without official sanction or backup. If something went wrong, the military would deny any knowledge of her existence. The flight to Afghanistan took 18 hours, with stops at bases that didn't appear on any public maps. Sarah traveled under a Canadian passport, identifying her as a freelance journalist named Rebecca Stone. Her equipment had been shipped separately through channels that left no official trail. When she finally arrived at a remote forward operating base in Kandahar province, she was met by Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reed, the leader of SEAL Team 5. Reed was initially skeptical about working with an unvetted sniper, especially one who appeared to be barely out of her teens. He had worked with military snipers before, and they were typically grizzled veterans with years of combat experience. Sarah looked like she should be in college, not providing overwatch for the most dangerous special operations missions in Afghanistan. His attitude changed completely after their first training session together. Reed had set up a shooting exercise to test Sarah's abilities under combat conditions. The targets were placed at various distances up to 1,200 yards, and she would need to engage them while his team moved through a simulated assault pattern. The exercise was designed to test not just accuracy, but also the ability to coordinate with ground forces and make split-second decisions about target priority. Sarah studied the course layout for exactly 3 minutes, then took her position on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. What followed was the most impressive display of marksmanship Reed had ever witnessed. Sarah engaged 17 targets in perfect sequence, never interfering with his team's movement pattern and never missing a shot. She had somehow calculated the entire tactical situation in her head, predicting where his men would be at each moment and timing her shots to provide maximum support without creating any friendly fire risks. When the exercise was complete, Reed approached her position with new respect. Over the following weeks, Reed learned that Sarah's skills extended far beyond just shooting. She could move through hostile terrain without leaving any trace, set up shooting positions in locations that seemed impossible to access, and remain hidden for days at a time if necessary. During their first actual combat mission together, she proved that her training had prepared her for the psychological challenges of warfare as well as the technical ones. The mission involved capturing a Taliban commander who had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. Intelligence indicated that he would be attending a meeting in a remote village, surrounded by heavily armed bodyguards. Reed's team would assault the compound while Sarah provided overwatch from a position nearly a mile away. The plan seemed straightforward until everything went wrong. The Taliban commander had been tipped off about the raid and had prepared an ambush. Reed's team found themselves pinned down by machine gun fire from multiple positions, taking casualties and unable to advance or retreat. Radio calls for air support were answered with the news that weather conditions had grounded all aircraft. Reed began to think they might not survive the night when Sarah's calm voice came over the radio. She had identified 7 enemy positions that were keeping the SEALs pinned down. One by one, she began taking them out with shots that seemed impossible under the circumstances. The range was extreme. Visibility was limited by dust and smoke, and she had to be careful not to hit Reed's men who were scattered throughout the area. Each shot was perfect, eliminating threats with surgical precision while creating opportunities for the SEALs to maneuver. When the firefight was over, Reed's team had completed their mission and captured the Taliban commander with no additional casualties. Sarah had fired 11 shots and eliminated 11 targets, some at ranges exceeding 1,400 yards. As Reed's team prepared to extract, Sarah simply vanished from her position, making her way back to base through routes that would leave no trace of her presence. The mission report made no mention of sniper support, and officially, the SEALs had accomplished everything through their own skill and determination. This pattern would repeat itself dozens of times over the following months. Sarah would appear when needed, provide invisible support for SEAL operations, then disappear again without leaving any evidence of her involvement. The team she supported began to develop an almost superstitious respect for their guardian angel. They knew that when they were in trouble, impossible shots would begin eliminating their enemies from distances that shouldn't have been possible. Word of the Phantom Sniper began to spread through Special Operations Command, even though no official reports acknowledged her existence. SEAL teams would request her support for their most dangerous missions, and somehow she would always appear when needed most. Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces in the region began to develop their own legends about the ghost who killed from impossible distances, someone who could see through walls and shoot through mountains. Sarah's handlers provided her with increasingly sophisticated equipment as her reputation grew. She received a custom rifle built specifically for extreme long-range shooting with a scope that incorporated laser range-finding, wind measurement, and ballistic calculation capabilities. Her ammunition was hand-loaded to specifications that provided accuracy levels beyond anything available to regular military units. She was also given access to real-time intelligence feeds that allowed her to track target movements and weather conditions with unprecedented precision. The psychological toll of her isolated existence began to show after 6 months in Afghanistan. Sarah was living a completely solitary life, with no friends, no family contact, and no normal human relationships. She would spend weeks at a time in remote observation posts, watching enemy movements, and preparing for missions that might never come. Her only human contact was during mission briefings and the occasional radio conversation with SEAL teams during operations. Her handlers were aware of the isolation's effects and provided psychological support through encrypted communications. A military psychologist known only as Dr. Parker conducted regular sessions with Sarah via secure satellite link, helping her maintain mental stability under conditions that would break most people. Dr. Parker explained that the isolation was both a necessary security measure and a deliberate training tool. The most effective snipers throughout history had been loners, people who could function independently for extended periods without psychological breakdown. Sarah's most challenging mission came during her 8th month in Afghanistan. Intelligence had identified a gathering of senior Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders planning a major offensive against coalition forces. The meeting was taking place in a mountain compound that was nearly impossible to assault directly, surrounded by multiple defensive positions and accessible only through narrow valleys that could easily be defended by a small force. Traditional military options were limited. An airstrike risked killing civilians who were also being held in the compound, and a ground assault would likely result in heavy casualties for minimal chance of success. Reed's team was tasked with conducting a reconnaissance mission to gather more intelligence, but the approach routes were so dangerous that any sizable force would be detected long before reaching observation positions. Sarah volunteered to infiltrate the area alone and provide both reconnaissance and precision elimination of key targets if the opportunity arose. The mission would require her to move through 20 miles of hostile territory, establish observation positions within 800 yards of the compound, and potentially remain in place for up to 2 weeks. If she was discovered or captured, no rescue would be possible, and no government would acknowledge her existence. The infiltration took 3 days of careful movement through terrain that challenged even Sarah's advanced training. She traveled only at night, hiding during daylight hours in positions that provided concealment from both ground observation and aerial surveillance. She carried minimal equipment, relying on cached supplies that had been pre-positioned by other intelligence assets weeks earlier. By the fourth day, she had reached a position that provided perfect observation of the target compound. What Sarah discovered during her surveillance exceeded all intelligence expectations. The gathering included not just regional Taliban leaders but senior al-Qaeda figures who were believed to be hiding in Pakistan. Over 30 high-value targets were present, representing an opportunity to severely damage terrorist operations throughout South Asia. However, the compound also held approximately 50 civilians, including women and children, who appeared to be family members of the terrorist leaders. Sarah spent 6 days documenting the compound's layout, guard rotations, and the movement patterns of both targets and civilians. She identified optimal shooting positions and calculated precise firing solutions for multiple scenarios. Her reports, transmitted in encrypted bursts during scheduled communication windows, provided intelligence that was immediately forwarded to the highest levels of military command. The decision was made to proceed with a modified version of the original plan. Reed's team would create a diversion by attacking an outlying guard position, drawing security forces away from the main compound. During the confusion, Sarah would eliminate as many high-value targets as possible before extracting through a pre-planned route. The operation would take place during the early morning hours when most of the compound would be asleep and civilian movement would be minimal. The morning of the operation dawned clear and calm, with perfect visibility and minimal wind. Sarah had positioned herself on a rocky ledge 750 yards from the compound, with multiple escape routes mapped out and equipment cached along each path. Reed's diversion began precisely at 0430 hours, drawing away roughly half of the compound security force. As planned, the remaining guards focused their attention on the direction of the attack, leaving Sarah with clear fields of fire. Over the next 12 minutes, Sarah engaged 23 targets with 23 shots. Each shot was calculated to minimize risk to civilians while eliminating confirmed terrorist leaders. She worked systematically through her target list, adjusting for the changing tactical situation as guards responded to each shot. When Reed's team began their withdrawal, signaling the end of the operation window, Sarah had eliminated virtually every high-value target in the compound. The extraction was nearly flawless until Sarah encountered a Taliban patrol that had been moving to reinforce the compound. Finding herself surrounded by 6 fighters in terrain that offered limited concealment, she was forced to engage targets at close range using skills that went far beyond her sniper training. The hand-to-hand combat techniques she had learned at Carlisle, combined with her expertise with secondary weapons, allowed her to eliminate the patrol and continue her escape. When Sarah reached the extraction point 18 hours later, she was exhausted, dehydrated, and carrying a minor wound from the close-range encounter. But the mission had been an unprecedented success. Intelligence analysis confirmed that the operation had eliminated the senior leadership of 3 separate terrorist organizations, disrupting planned attacks that could have killed hundreds of coalition forces and civilians. Reed's team extraction went smoothly, but they had no knowledge of Sarah's parallel operation. Their mission report described a successful reconnaissance that had unfortunately failed to locate any high-value targets. Official records would show that the terrorist leaders had been killed by infighting among different factions, a cover story that protected Sarah's existence while allowing intelligence agencies to exploit the operational success. For Sarah, the mission represented both a professional triumph and a personal turning point. She had proven herself capable of operating independently in the most challenging conditions imaginable, but she had also reached the psychological limits of her isolation. In her post-mission debrief, she requested a transfer to a different operational area, somewhere that would provide new challenges while allowing her to maintain the effectiveness that had made her invaluable to Special Operations Forces. Sarah's transfer request was approved faster than she had expected, but not to the location she had anticipated. Instead of being reassigned to a different theater of operations, she found herself back in the United States for the first time in over a year. The meeting location was a secure facility buried beneath a government building that appeared on no official maps, where she was debriefed by analysts who seemed to know more about her Afghanistan operations than she remembered telling anyone. The intelligence community had been tracking Sarah's performance with growing interest. Her success rate was unprecedented, not just in terms of target elimination, but in the complete absence of operational compromises. In 14 months of operations, she had never been detected, never left evidence of her presence, and never required extraction assistance. Several different agencies were now competing for her services, each with missions that required her unique combination of skills. Director Walsh appeared for the first time since Sarah's graduation from Carlisle, looking older and more serious than Sarah remembered. Walsh explained that Sarah's next assignment would be fundamentally different from her work in Afghanistan. Instead of supporting military operations, she would be working directly for intelligence agencies on missions that required complete deniability. These operations would take place in countries where the United States had no official military presence, targeting individuals whose elimination could not be accomplished through conventional means. The briefing for Sarah's new assignment took place over 3 days in a secure facility where she was introduced to technologies and intelligence resources that seemed almost science-fictional. Satellite surveillance systems could track individual targets in real time anywhere on Earth. Facial recognition software could identify subjects even when they were disguised or surgically altered. Communications intercepts could predict target movements days in advance, creating opportunities for precision operations that would have been impossible just years earlier. Sarah's first assignment under this new program involved traveling to Eastern Europe, where a former Russian intelligence officer was selling nuclear weapons technology to terrorist organizations. The target, identified only as Volkov, had managed to avoid assassination attempts by 3 different intelligence agencies through a combination of sophisticated security measures and an apparent sixth sense for danger. Traditional approaches had failed because Volkov never followed predictable patterns and never stayed in any location long enough for conventional operations. The mission parameters were unlike anything Sarah had encountered before. She would have complete operational independence, with no backup and no official support. Her target was known to be extremely dangerous, with hand-to-hand combat skills that had made him legendary within Russian special forces. Most importantly, the elimination had to appear completely accidental, with no evidence that could be traced back to any government agency. Sarah spent 2 weeks studying Volkov's background and movement patterns through intelligence files that documented every aspect of his life over the previous 5 years. He was paranoid to an almost pathological degree, changing locations daily and using different identities for every transaction. However, the intelligence analysts had identified one potential weakness in his security protocol. Volkov had a monthly meeting with his primary weapons contact at locations throughout Eastern Europe, and these meetings followed certain patterns that might be exploitable. The next meeting was scheduled to take place in Prague, at a location that wouldn't be confirmed until hours before the actual event. Sarah arrived in the city 3 days early, using a German passport that identified her as a graduate student researching medieval architecture. She spent time establishing her cover identity, visiting tourist sites and creating the kind of documentation trail that would support her official reason for being in Prague. Using intelligence assets that had been pre-positioned throughout the city, Sarah was able to identify 3 potential meeting locations within hours of Volkov's arrival. Each location presented different challenges and opportunities, but all were in heavily populated areas, where any shooting would be complicated by civilian presence. Traditional sniper positions were either impossible to access or would provide poor escape routes. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that she could use Prague's famous architecture to her advantage. The city's numerous church spires and medieval towers provided elevated positions that would allow extreme long-range shots while remaining completely invisible to ground-level observation. The challenge would be making shots at distances that pushed her equipment and abilities to their absolute limits. Sarah selected a position in the bell tower of St. Canada, Vitus Cathedral, nearly 2 miles from the most likely meeting location. The shot would require her to fire across Prague's historic center, over multiple buildings and through air currents affected by the city's complex topography. Weather conditions would be critical, and she would have only minutes to set up and take the shot once Volkov's exact location was confirmed. The intelligence proved accurate when Sarah received confirmation that Volkov would be meeting his contact in Wenceslas Square at exactly 3 p.m. She had 90 minutes to reach her position, set up her equipment, and prepare for what would be the longest shot of her career. Moving through Prague while carrying a sniper rifle required careful planning, but Sarah's equipment had been designed for exactly this kind of challenge. Her rifle broke down into components that fit easily into a large camera case, the kind commonly carried by tourists photographing Prague's historic sites. The scope and other precision instruments were disguised as photographic equipment that would pass casual inspection. Even if authorities searched her gear, they would find only expensive camera equipment belonging to a dedicated architecture photographer. Reaching the bell tower required Sarah to use infiltration techniques that went far beyond her sniper training. The cathedral was open to tourists, but access to the upper levels was restricted and monitored by security cameras. Sarah had studied the building's layout through architectural plans, identifying service corridors and maintenance access points that would allow her to reach the tower without being detected by conventional security. The climb to the shooting position took 45 minutes of careful movement through areas of the cathedral that hadn't been accessed in decades. Sarah had to navigate around alarm systems, avoid areas with motion detectors, and pick locks that protected access to the bell tower. When she finally reached her position, she had less than 30 minutes to set up equipment and prepare for the shot. The view from the bell tower was breathtaking, providing a panoramic view of Prague that stretched for miles in every direction. But Sarah's attention was focused on a single point nearly 2 miles away, where intelligence indicated Volkov would appear in less than 20 minutes. The range was extreme by any standard, requiring calculations that took into account not just distance and wind, but also air density, temperature variations, and even the rotation of the Earth. Sarah's equipment included a ballistic computer that could perform these calculations automatically, but she preferred to work through the mathematics herself as a backup. The shot would require her to aim nearly 6 feet above and 3 feet to the left of her actual target, compensating for bullet drop and wind drift over the extended range. Any error in her calculations or execution would result in either a complete miss or, worse, civilian casualties. At 2:57 p.m., Sarah's spotting scope confirmed that Volkov had arrived at the meeting location exactly as intelligence had predicted. He was accompanied by 2 bodyguards and was meeting with a man who intelligence identified as his primary weapons contact. The group was standing in an area of Wenceslas Square that provided Sarah with a clear shot, but civilian foot traffic meant she would have only seconds to take the shot when conditions were optimal. Sarah controlled her breathing and began the mental process that preceded every shot. Time seemed to slow as she made final adjustments to her scope settings and confirmed her calculations one last time. At 3:03 p.m., a temporary gap in pedestrian traffic provided the clear shot she needed. Her target was clearly visible through her scope, unaware that he was being observed from nearly 2 miles away. The shot took 3.2 seconds to travel from Sarah's position to the target. During that time, Sarah remained absolutely motionless, knowing that even the smallest movement could affect the bullet's trajectory over such an extreme distance. Through her scope, she watched as her bullet found its target with perfect precision, eliminating Volkov instantly while leaving his companions completely unaware of what had happened. The bodyguard's initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm, as they had heard no gunshot and seen no obvious threat. By the time they realized their principal was dead, Sarah was already breaking down her equipment and preparing to leave the bell tower. The shot had been so precise that investigators would later conclude Volkov had suffered a medical emergency, possibly a heart attack or stroke brought on by stress. Sarah's extraction from Prague was accomplished exactly as planned, with no indication that she had ever been anything other than a German graduate student studying medieval architecture. Her cover identity held up perfectly during routine customs checks, and her equipment passed inspection as professional photography gear. Within 18 hours, she was back in the United States being debriefed on a mission that officially had never taken place. The intelligence impact of Volkov's elimination was immediate and substantial. Without his expertise and connections, the nuclear smuggling network he had been coordinating collapsed within weeks. Several planned terrorist attacks were prevented when weapons shipments failed to materialize, and dozens of weapons dealers were arrested when their communication networks were compromised by intelligence assets that had been monitoring Volkov's activities. Sarah's handlers were impressed not just by the technical difficulty of the shot she had accomplished, but by her operational security throughout the mission. Intelligence agencies throughout Europe had investigated Volkov's death extensively, but they had found no evidence of foreign involvement. The mission represented a perfect example of how surgical elimination could achieve strategic objectives without creating political complications. The success in Prague led to additional assignments that pushed Sarah's abilities in different directions. Her next mission took her to South America, where she was tasked with eliminating a drug cartel leader who had been coordinating attacks against American anti-narcotics personnel. The target was protected by a private army of former military personnel and never appeared in public without extensive security precautions. This mission required Sarah to operate in jungle terrain that was completely different from anything she had experienced before. The humidity affected her equipment's performance, the thick vegetation limited sight lines to a few hundred yards at most, and the constant threat of government and cartel patrols made extended observation impossible. She spent 3 weeks learning to operate in this environment, developing new techniques for concealment and target acquisition that would serve her well in future assignments. The elimination itself required Sarah to infiltrate a remote compound during a meeting between cartel leaders. Using skills that combined her sniper training with close-quarters combat techniques, she eliminated 3 targets in rapid succession before extracting through jungle terrain that would have challenged experienced Special Forces soldiers. The operation was attributed to rivalry between competing cartels, maintaining the fiction that Sarah didn't exist. Over the following 18 months, Sarah completed assignments on 4 different continents, each presenting unique challenges that expanded her operational capabilities. She eliminated targets in urban environments where civilians were present, in remote wilderness areas where survival skills were as important as marksmanship, and in hostile countries where capture would mean certain death. Her success rate remained perfect, with no operational compromises and no evidence left behind that could compromise future missions. The psychological toll of this lifestyle was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Sarah was living multiple identities simultaneously, speaking different languages daily and forming no lasting human connections. Her handlers continued to provide psychological support. But Dr. Parker expressed growing concern about Sarah's long-term mental health. The isolation that made her so effective was also creating psychological stress that could eventually affect her performance. Sarah's most challenging assignment came when she was tasked with eliminating a terrorist leader who was planning attacks against American embassies throughout Africa. The target had survived multiple assassination attempts by maintaining perfect operational security and never appearing in the same location twice. Intelligence indicated that he would be attending a meeting in Somalia, but the exact location wouldn't be known until hours before the event. This mission would require Sarah to operate in one of the most dangerous countries in the world, with no backup and no possibility of official rescue if anything went wrong. Somalia's ongoing civil war meant that any foreign presence risked becoming involved in conflicts that had nothing to do with her mission objectives. Most importantly, the target was known to use sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques that had defeated previous intelligence operations. Sarah spent 2 months preparing for the Somalia mission, learning about the country's complex political situation and studying the target's background in unprecedented detail. She would need to understand not just his security protocols, but also the cultural and religious factors that influenced his decision-making. The mission would test every aspect of her training and push her abilities to their absolute limits. The flight to Somalia took Sarah through a circuitous route designed to hide her ultimate destination from any intelligence service that might be monitoring international travel patterns. She flew first to Turkey using her German identity, then to Kenya as a Canadian aid worker, and finally into Somalia on a United Nations humanitarian flight that provided perfect cover for her infiltration. By the time she reached Mogadishu, she had become Dr. Emily Harrison, a medical researcher studying tropical diseases for the World Health Organization. Somalia presented challenges unlike anything Sarah had encountered in her previous assignments. The country was effectively controlled by competing warlords and terrorist groups, with no functioning government and minimal infrastructure. Security conditions changed hourly as different factions fought for control of territory and resources. Most importantly, foreign aid workers were prime targets for kidnapping, making Sarah's cover identity both necessary for access and dangerous for survival. Her target, known only as al-Masri, was one of al-Qaeda's most senior operational commanders in East Africa. Intelligence indicated that he was coordinating attacks not just against American interests, but also against African governments that supported counterterrorism operations. His elimination would disrupt planned attacks against embassies in Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, potentially saving hundreds of lives while dealing a significant blow to terrorist networks throughout the region. Al-Masri's security protocols were sophisticated enough to have protected him for over 5 years of intensive manhunt efforts by multiple intelligence agencies. He never used electronic communications, traveled only with trusted associates who had known him for decades, and changed his appearance and identity documents regularly. Most importantly, he had survived previous assassination attempts by maintaining an almost supernatural awareness of potential threats. Sarah's intelligence briefing included psychological profiles suggesting that al-Masri suffered from severe paranoid personality disorder, which actually enhanced his survival instincts while making him nearly impossible to approach through conventional means. He trusted virtually no one, suspected everyone of being potential enemies, and made decisions based on instincts that had kept him alive when more trusting terrorist leaders had been eliminated. The challenge was compounded by Somalia's chaotic environment, where Sarah would need to operate without official support while maintaining her medical researcher cover identity. She would need to establish legitimate reasons for being in areas where al-Masri might appear, while avoiding the kidnapping attempts and factional violence that made Somalia one of the most dangerous countries in the world for foreigners. Sarah's first weeks in Mogadishu were spent establishing her cover identity through work with legitimate medical organizations. She treated patients at refugee camps, conducted research at local hospitals, and documented disease patterns that would support her official reason for being in the country. This work also provided perfect justification for traveling throughout regions where al-Masri was known to operate, as medical emergencies occurred regularly in areas controlled by different warlords. The intelligence breakthrough came when Sarah learned that al-Masri's wife was suffering from a serious medical condition that required regular treatment. Despite his paranoid security measures, al-Masri was devoted to his family and had been secretly arranging medical care for his wife through trusted intermediaries. Sarah realized that she could use her medical cover to gain access to these treatment networks, potentially creating opportunities to locate her target. Working through contacts she had developed during her legitimate medical work, Sarah was able to identify the doctor who was treating al-Masri's wife. Dr. Ahmed Hassan was a Somali physician who had been educated in Egypt and had returned to help his people despite the country's dangerous conditions. Hassan was unaware of his patient's husband's identity, knowing her only as the wife of a wealthy businessman who preferred to remain anonymous for security reasons. Sarah approached Hassan with a proposal to collaborate on research into the medical condition affecting his patient. As a WHO researcher, she could provide access to experimental treatments and medications that weren't available through normal channels in Somalia. Hassan was eager to help his patient and agreed to the collaboration, unknowingly providing Sarah with access to al-Masri's family. The approach required Sarah to actually provide legitimate medical treatment while using the opportunity to gather intelligence. She spent days developing treatment protocols that would genuinely help Hassan's patient, while creating reasons for multiple visits and extended observation periods. The medical work was challenging enough that it required her full attention, making it difficult to simultaneously conduct surveillance and prepare for her primary mission. Over the course of several weeks, Sarah was able to establish patterns in al-Masri's security procedures through careful observation of his wife's treatment schedule. He never appeared personally, but his security teams followed predictable protocols when arranging transportation and establishing perimeter security around the medical facility. More importantly, Sarah learned that he was planning to relocate his family to a compound outside Mogadishu, where his wife could receive extended treatment in a more secure environment. The compound was located in territory controlled by al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization that provided al-Masri with protection and logistical support. Intelligence indicated that the compound included sophisticated security measures, multiple escape routes, and enough armed guards to resist most conventional assault attempts. However, the location also provided Sarah with potential shooting positions that would allow her to engage targets from extreme range while remaining in territory controlled by rival factions. Sarah's reconnaissance of the compound required her to travel through some of the most dangerous territory in Somalia while maintaining her medical researcher cover. She arranged to visit refugee camps and medical facilities in the region, creating legitimate reasons for being in areas where most foreigners would never venture. These trips allowed her to study the compound's layout, identify potential shooting positions, and plan extraction routes that would take her through territory where she could blend into local populations. The intelligence picture that emerged from Sarah's reconnaissance was sobering. The compound was heavily fortified with multiple layers of security and enough armed personnel to defeat most conventional assault attempts. Al-Masri himself rarely appeared outside the main building, and when he did, he was accompanied by bodyguards who maintained constant surveillance of potential threat vectors. Any attempt to eliminate him would require perfect timing and flawless execution. Sarah's opportunity came when intelligence indicated that al-Masri would be meeting with senior al-Qaeda leaders from Yemen and Pakistan at the compound. The meeting would bring together some of the most wanted terrorists in the world, creating an opportunity to eliminate multiple high-value targets with a single operation. However, the increased security for the meeting would make the operation exponentially more dangerous. The shooting position Sarah selected was located on a hillside nearly 1,800 yards from the compound, well beyond the range where al-Masri's security teams would expect threats to originate. The position provided excellent concealment while offering clear sightlines to areas where intelligence indicated the meeting would take place. Most importantly, the location allowed Sarah to establish multiple extraction routes through territory controlled by different factions. Reaching the shooting position required Sarah to travel through areas where firefights between different groups occurred daily. She moved only at night, carrying minimal equipment and relying on cached supplies that intelligence assets had pre-positioned throughout the region. The journey took 4 nights of careful movement, with Sarah hiding during daylight hours in positions that provided concealment from both ground and aerial observation. Setting up the final shooting position was complicated by the need to remain hidden for potentially days while waiting for the target meeting to occur. Sarah created a hide that was virtually invisible from ground level while providing the precise shooting angle she needed for the extreme range shot. The position was uncomfortable enough that most people would be unable to remain motionless for more than a few hours, but Sarah's training had prepared her for exactly this kind of endurance challenge. The target meeting began on the second day of Sarah's vigil, with high-value targets arriving throughout the morning hours. Through her scope, Sarah was able to confirm the identities of multiple terrorists whose elimination had been prioritized by intelligence agencies throughout the world. However, al-Masri himself remained inside the compound's main building, protected by walls that made any shot impossible. Sarah's patience was rewarded. On the afternoon of the second day, when al-Masri emerged from the building to greet a particularly important visitor, for approximately 30 seconds he would be exposed in an area where Sarah had a clear shot. The range was extreme, the wind conditions were challenging, and she would have only one opportunity to take the shot before al-Masri's security protocols would move him back to safety. The shot required every skill Sarah had developed over years of training and operational experience. She had to account for wind patterns affected by the compound's buildings, air density changes caused by afternoon heating, and the rotation of the Earth over the extended time of flight. Her calculations indicated that she would need to aim nearly 8 feet above and 4 feet to the side of her actual target to compensate for the various factors affecting bullet trajectory. At exactly 3:47 p.m., Sarah took the shot that would later be analyzed by ballistics experts as one of the most difficult confirmed eliminations in the history of warfare. The bullet traveled for over 4 seconds before finding its target with perfect precision, eliminating al-Masri instantly, while leaving his associates completely unaware of what had happened. The extreme range meant that the gunshot was inaudible at the compound, creating confusion about how their leader had suddenly collapsed. Sarah remained motionless in her position for another 6 hours, watching as security forces searched frantically for threats they couldn't identify. Only after darkness fell did she begin breaking down her equipment and preparing for extraction. The elimination had been so precise that investigators would later conclude al-Masri had suffered a heart attack, maintaining the fiction that his death was from natural causes. The extraction from Somalia proved to be more challenging than the original infiltration, as al-Masri's associates had established checkpoints throughout the region in their search for whoever might have been responsible for his death. Sarah had to modify her planned extraction route multiple times, avoiding areas where security forces were conducting intensive searches. The journey back to Mogadishu took 6 days instead of the planned 3, requiring her to survive on minimal supplies while avoiding detection by increasingly paranoid security forces. When Sarah finally reached the United Nations compound in Mogadishu, she had been operating independently for 3 weeks while maintaining perfect cover as a medical researcher. Her extraction was accomplished through the same humanitarian flight system that had brought her into the country, with no indication that she had been anything other than a dedicated health physician working to help Somali civilians. The intelligence impact of al-Masri's elimination exceeded all expectations. Within days, planned attacks against multiple American embassies had been cancelled due to leadership confusion within terrorist networks. Several other high-value targets were captured when al-Masri's encrypted communication devices were recovered and analyzed by intelligence agencies. Most importantly, the terrorist organization's East African operations were disrupted so completely that they required months to re-establish effective command and control. Sarah's return to the United States marked another milestone in her unofficial career. She had now operated successfully on multiple continents, eliminating targets under conditions that would challenge the most elite military and intelligence personnel. Her psychological evaluations showed some signs of stress, but Dr. Parker concluded that she remained fully operational and capable of handling additional assignments. However, the Somalia mission had pushed Sarah's operational independence to its limits. For 3 weeks, she had been completely cut off from any support, operating in hostile territory where capture would have meant certain death. The experience had reinforced her confidence in her abilities while also highlighting the extreme isolation that defined her existence. She was becoming the most effective covert operative her handlers had ever managed, but she was also becoming increasingly detached from any normal human experience. The debriefing for the Somalia mission took place over several days, with intelligence analysts from multiple agencies studying every aspect of Sarah's operation. They were particularly interested in her techniques for maintaining cover while conducting surveillance, her methods for calculating extreme-range shots under adverse conditions, and her ability to extract from hostile territory without leaving any trace of her presence. Several senior intelligence officials attended the final debriefing session, indicating the level of interest Sarah's capabilities had generated throughout the intelligence community. They discussed potential future assignments that would make use of her unique skills, including operations in countries where traditional military or intelligence assets couldn't operate effectively. The meeting concluded with authorization for Sarah to receive additional training and equipment that would expand her operational capabilities even further. But Sarah's most dangerous assignment was yet to come. Intelligence had identified a threat that would require all of her skills and push her abilities beyond anything she had previously attempted. The mission would take her back to Afghanistan. But this time, she wouldn't be supporting SEAL operations. She would be operating completely independently against targets that had learned from previous operations and were specifically prepared to counter threats like the ones she represented. Sarah's return to Afghanistan came 18 months after her last operation in the region, and the country had changed in ways that made her previous successes seem almost simple by comparison. The Taliban had adapted their tactics based on painful lessons learned from encountering her invisible presence during SEAL operations. They had developed new security protocols specifically designed to counter long-range sniper threats, including the use of decoy targets, sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques, and security perimeters that extended far beyond traditional ranges. The intelligence briefing revealed a threat unlike anything Sarah had previously encountered. A new Taliban commander named Hafez al-Kandahari had emerged as the most effective leader their forces had produced in years. He was coordinating a series of attacks that were killing coalition forces at an alarming rate, while using tactics that suggested advanced military training far beyond what most Taliban fighters possessed. Intelligence indicated that al-Kandahari was a former Afghan military officer who had been trained by American advisors before switching sides and bringing his Western military education to the insurgency. What made al-Kandahari particularly dangerous was his apparent awareness of American special operations capabilities. He had studied previous SEAL missions in detail and had developed countermeasures that neutralized many of the advantages that had made those operations successful. His forces used communication security that prevented intelligence interception, moved in patterns that avoided satellite surveillance, and established security protocols that made traditional military approaches extremely costly. Most concerning was intelligence suggesting that al-Kandahari was aware of Sarah's previous operations and was specifically preparing defenses against long-range sniper threats. He had reportedly obtained sophisticated detection equipment that could identify sniper positions from extreme distances, and his security teams included former military personnel with counter-sniper training. Several intelligence assets had been killed while attempting to gather information about his organization, suggesting that his security awareness was beyond anything Taliban forces had previously demonstrated. Sarah's mission parameters reflected the elevated threat level. She would be operating without any military support, in an area where al-Kandahari's forces controlled the terrain and could respond rapidly to any detected threats. The mission timeline was compressed, as intelligence indicated that al-Kandahari was planning a major offensive that would kill hundreds of coalition personnel if not prevented. Most importantly, traditional approaches had already failed, with 2 previous special operations missions resulting in significant casualties without achieving their objectives. The infiltration into Afghanistan required Sarah to use cover identities and routes that had never been employed before, as intelligence suggested that al-Kandahari's network had penetrated some of the systems used for previous covert entries. She traveled through Pakistan using documentation identifying her as an aid worker with a Norwegian humanitarian organization, then crossed into Afghanistan through remote border areas controlled by tribal groups that operated independently of both governments. The journey into al-Kandahari's operational area required 2 weeks of careful movement through territory where her previous successes had created a dangerous reputation. Taliban forces throughout the region were aware that an invisible sniper had been eliminating their leaders, and they had established patrol patterns and security procedures designed to detect any similar threats. Sarah had to develop new techniques for remaining undetected while moving through areas where every civilian could potentially be an informant or security asset. Her reconnaissance of al-Kandahari's organization revealed that the intelligence reports had actually underestimated the challenge she was facing. The Taliban commander had established multiple layers of security that extended for miles around his operational areas, with sophisticated communication networks that allowed rapid response to any detected threats. His personal security included former Afghan Special Forces soldiers who understood American tactics and equipment well enough to develop effective countermeasures. Most troubling was evidence that al-Kandahari was using his own snipers as part of his security protocol. These weren't typical Taliban fighters with limited training, but experienced shooters who had received formal military instruction and were equipped with precision rifles and advanced optics. They were positioned at extreme ranges around areas where al-Kandahari might appear, creating a defensive network that could engage threats at distances approaching Sarah's own operational capabilities. Sarah spent 3 weeks studying al-Kandahari's patterns and security procedures, using observation techniques that pushed her camouflage and concealment skills to their limits. She established multiple hide positions that allowed her to monitor his organization's activities while remaining undetected by security sweeps that occurred regularly throughout the area. The intelligence she gathered revealed that al-Kandahari was indeed planning a major offensive, but the scale exceeded all previous estimates. The planned offensive would involve coordinated attacks against multiple coalition bases, using insider information that suggested al-Kandahari had sources within Afghan military units. The attacks were designed to maximize casualties while minimizing Taliban losses, using tactics that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of coalition vulnerabilities. If successful, the offensive would force a significant reduction in American presence throughout the region while providing al-Kandahari with weapons and equipment captured from overrun bases. Sarah's analysis identified a narrow window of opportunity when al-Kandahari would be vulnerable to elimination. Intelligence indicated that he would be conducting a final coordination meeting with sub-commanders before the offensive began, gathering the leadership in one location for the first time in months. However, the meeting location was protected by the most sophisticated security Sarah had ever encountered, with overlapping fields of fire that covered all potential sniper positions within normal engagement ranges. The shooting position Sarah selected was located over 2 miles from the target area, at the absolute limit of her equipment's capabilities, and beyond the range where al-Kandahari's security teams expected threats to originate. The position was on a mountain peak that required technical climbing skills to access, in terrain so difficult that al-Kandahari's forces had apparently concluded it was impossible for anyone to establish effective shooting positions there. Reaching the position required Sarah to carry climbing equipment in addition to her normal operational gear, making the approach significantly more challenging than any of her previous missions. She had to move through areas where avalanche risks made travel extremely dangerous, while avoiding detection by security patrols that used sophisticated surveillance equipment. The final approach to the shooting position required 12 hours of technical climbing in conditions that would challenge experienced mountaineers. The shooting position itself was a narrow ledge barely wide enough for Sarah and her equipment, with no protection from weather and no possibility of retreat if her position was discovered. She would need to remain motionless for potentially days while waiting for the target meeting to occur, in conditions where any movement could result in detection by al-Kandahari's counter-surveillance teams. The psychological pressure of maintaining perfect stillness while knowing that discovery would mean certain death added another layer of difficulty to an already impossible mission. Sarah's vigil on the mountain ledge lasted 4 days, during which she observed al-Kandahari's security procedures with growing respect for his tactical sophistication. His counter-sniper team systematically swept all potential shooting positions within conventional ranges, using techniques that would have detected less skilled operators. His personal movement patterns were completely unpredictable, with multiple decoys and security teams that made target identification extremely difficult even through advanced optics. The target meeting finally occurred on the morning of the 5th day, with al-Kandahari and his sub-commanders gathering in an area that provided Sarah with her only clear shot opportunity. The range was 2,347 yards, requiring calculations that pushed ballistic science to its theoretical limits. Environmental conditions included variable winds affected by mountain terrain, air density changes caused by altitude, and temperature variations that would affect bullet trajectory throughout its extended flight time. Sarah's equipment included a ballistic computer that could perform the necessary calculations, but the extreme range meant that even small errors in environmental measurement could result in complete misses. She spent an hour taking precise measurements of wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, temperature variations throughout the bullet's flight path, and atmospheric pressure changes that would affect ballistic performance. Her final calculations indicated that she would need to aim nearly 12 feet above her target and 6 feet to the side to compensate for all variables affecting the shot. At 9:23 a.m., Sarah took what would be recorded as the longest confirmed sniper elimination in military history. The bullet required over 5 seconds to travel from her position to the target, during which time Sarah remained absolutely motionless while tracking the target through her scope. Environmental conditions were perfect, with minimal wind and clear visibility that allowed her to observe the bullet's impact with perfect precision. Al-Kandahari was eliminated instantly by a shot that his security teams never detected. The extreme range meant that no gunshot was audible at the target location, and the bullet's trajectory took it over terrain that concealed Sarah's position from any ground-level observation. His security team spent hours searching for threats they couldn't identify, eventually concluding that their leader had suffered some kind of medical emergency. Sarah remained in position for another 8 hours, watching as al-Kandahari's organization struggled to maintain operational security without their leader's guidance. The sub-commanders who had survived the meeting were unable to agree on leadership succession, and their planned offensive began falling apart within hours of al-Kandahari's death. By evening, Sarah could observe Taliban forces beginning to withdraw from forward positions as the command structure collapsed. The extraction from the mountain position was accomplished under cover of darkness, with Sarah descending routes that would leave no trace of her presence. The technical climbing required even more skill during descent than it had during the approach, as she had to navigate difficult terrain while carrying equipment in complete darkness. The journey back to extraction points took 6 days of careful movement through areas where Taliban forces were conducting increasingly desperate searches. Sarah's extraction from Afghanistan was accomplished through the same Pakistani route she had used for infiltration, but the journey was complicated by increased border security as Pakistani forces responded to Taliban activity spilling across the frontier. She was forced to modify her extraction route several times, ultimately spending 3 weeks in hostile territory before reaching safe areas where her extraction could be completed. The intelligence impact of al-Kandahari's elimination was immediate and comprehensive. The planned Taliban offensive collapsed completely as sub-commanders fought among themselves for leadership control. Weapons caches that had been prepared for the offensive were captured when Taliban forces abandoned their positions during the leadership crisis. Most importantly, several coalition bases that would have been attacked remained secure, preventing casualties that could have numbered in the hundreds. Sarah's return to the United States marked the end of an operational career that had redefined what was possible for covert elimination operations. Over 3 years, she had completed missions that pushed the boundaries of sniper capabilities while maintaining perfect operational security. Her elimination of al-Kandahari at extreme range had demonstrated technical skills that were beyond anything previously achieved in combat conditions. The debriefing process revealed that Sarah's psychological condition remained stable despite the extreme isolation and stress of her operational lifestyle. Dr. Parker's evaluations showed some signs of combat fatigue, but Sarah's mental resilience had proven capable of handling challenges that would have broken most people. However, the evaluations also revealed that Sarah had reached the limits of what could be accomplished through her current operational model. Intelligence agencies were beginning to develop new technologies and operational concepts that would change how covert elimination missions were conducted. Drone technology was advancing to the point where many targets could be eliminated without requiring human operators in hostile territory. Satellite surveillance was becoming sophisticated enough to track targets continuously, reducing the need for extended field operations. Sarah's unique skills would remain valuable, but the era of completely independent operators was beginning to evolve toward more technologically supported approaches. Sarah's final meeting with her handlers took place in the same anonymous facility where her career had begun 3 years earlier. Director Walsh, looking older and more tired than Sarah remembered, explained that Sarah's operational success had exceeded all expectations, while proving that certain types of missions were possible with the right combination of skills and support. However, the political environment was changing in ways that made her type of completely deniable operations increasingly difficult to justify. The meeting concluded with an offer that Sarah had never expected. Instead of continuing as an operational asset, she could transition to a training role where she would pass on her skills to the next generation of covert operators. The position would provide some level of normal life while allowing her to contribute to national security in ways that built on her unique experience. For the first time in years, Sarah would have the opportunity to form genuine human relationships while using her abilities to serve her country. Sarah's decision was immediate. She had accomplished everything possible as a completely independent operator, proving that surgical precision could achieve strategic objectives without creating political complications. Now it was time to ensure that others could continue that mission even as technology and tactics evolved. She officially didn't exist, but every SEAL who had served with her support would remember the woman who had watched their backs from impossible distances. And every student she would train would carry forward the legend of the ghost in the crosshairs. Her war was over, but her legacy would continue through those she would teach to shoot with perfect precision from positions where officially no one had ever been.